Good afternoon. My name is Ndirangu, and I'm very honored to be here. Thanks for coming. This afternoon, I'd like to tell you a series of stories that I hope come together to tell a larger story. They begin with my favorite bedtime story, The People Could Fly. Told by Virginia Hamilton, it focuses on the lives of a few African slaves brought to the Americas to farm cotton. One of the slaves, with her son firmly wrapped on her back, under the fear and the weight of her subjugation, was reminded of the truth. The holistic heritage and history, the fullness of her blackness and Africanness, and consequently, she sprouted majestic wings and flew home. When I was younger, some of my friends and I used to play this game where we would compare each other's dads. You'd be like, oh, my dad is so much stronger than your dad, or my dad is so much faster than your dad, or my dad has a better car than your dad does. And despite not having my own father to contrast these situations to, I always knew that I had a mother who could fly. I remember being in Germany. I think I was 3 or 4 years old at the time. And we were visiting some of my mom's friends. And for the second leg of our journey, we were coming here to the US. At the time, I was stamped as a dependent in my mom's passport. And so when we arrived at the airport in Germany, we were rejected entry onto the flight. We were directed to the American consulate. And when we arrived there, trying to explain our precarious situation, we were greeted by a soldier who cocked his rifle and pointed it at my mother and I and told us to get the hell out of there. It's then that I knew that no amount of speed or strength was comparable to the fact of my mother's formidable fortitude and fearlessness. See, then, flight and even time were an extension of my mother's fantastic powers. And so, despite being able to reach over my big head and touch my adjacent ear, as per my auntie's instructions for joining Class 1, my mother hadn't declared a time. And so when the day finally came for me to have my interview with my soon-to-be Class 1 teacher, I was so excited. He introduced himself to me as Victor Mwai and told me that we would have an exclusive meeting that would take 15 minutes. This transformed my feeling of excitement into extreme importance, and I reassured my mother that 15 minutes was in fact the time it took for a spaceship to get from Earth to the moon. This is because she can fly, and it'd be important for her to know how long the journey takes. But on this occasion, the remark was meant for my soon-to-be teacher. I was convinced that if he heard this comment, he would have no choice but to allow me to join Class 1, owing to my brilliance. And so, a series of fond events, an eternity of good memories passed between that day and the day that I finally was woken up by my mom and told it's time to go to school. I jumped out of bed, threw my sandwich in my entirely empty bag, and ran to school. I went to the Nairobi Waldorf School, which was an international school in one of the suburbs of the capital of Kenya, Nairobi. Our first assignment, was to stand in front of the class and say our names. My last name starts with a W, so I think I was the last to go. And as I finished the 7th syllable of my rhythmic-sounding name, I was met with chuckles of laughter. And I was like, wait, did I say my own name wrong? But it was only later that I realized that the laughter was, in fact, because I had said it right. And so what's your name? It's a relatively simple question. It's one of the first questions we learn to respond to when we learn a different language. My name is long. It's complicated. And for most of my life, it's been one of the hardest questions to answer. And so instead, I'll tell you another tale. One that begins with the young men and women of the village who were invited for the annual ball. They dressed in their most elaborate clothing and went to the center of the village. The tale tells us that on this occasion, one of the young men was particularly dashing, and all of the young women came to talk to him. He invited them to his house for more song, dance, and celebration, and only the prettiest girls were allowed to join him. One of the girls, the tale tells us once again, who wasn't as pretty, decided to go anyway. They wandered deeper and deeper into the forest. The young girls enamored by the man's charm and beauty. The other girl, however, couldn't help but notice that each time a fly landed on the back of the man's head, it vanished. She tried to warn her friends, but they were like, you're not as pretty, so we're not going to listen to you. Eventually, when they arrived at the epicenter of the forest, the house was ominously quiet. And it's now she knew, or she began to suspect at least, that the man was in fact Irigi, the giant, who used cunning and charm to lure people in before making them his dinner. It's with cautionary tales such as these that my grandmother was brought up with. The sun was beginning to set on the British Empire, and in Kenya, who you trusted or associated yourself with could get you tortured or killed. And so my grandmother's mother told her stories such as this to teach her the importance of discipline and discernment. Her father died when she was very young, but together they were small-scale agricultural farmers and strict Roman Catholics who instilled in her the importance of discipline that had materialized into her nursing profession. My grandfather, who I was named after, according to his brother, who's my Guka Warugongo, was a tall, strong, black, erudite, and handsome man. Nobody loved him more than my grandmother. Together, in this soon-to-be post-colonial Kenya, they began to form their family, my 4 fantastic uncles and their 6 daughters, Wanjiro, Wairimo, Washera, Wangare, Wamboi, and Nyakenywa, my heroes. I'm lucky, not only did I get to meet my heroes, but I was raised by them. And it would be very hard for me to articulate the power and the strength, the groundedness, the joy, and the laughter that they have brought us up with. Once a month, we would have what we call sisters' meetings. We would gather together, most of our family, to celebrate our queen, my grandmother, reflect upon the memory of my grandfather, and then eat, which was my favorite part. I love chapatis so much. And so after slaughtering the goat, I would run back to the kitchen to try and learn how to make my auntie's soft, fluffy chapos. Oftentimes I failed. By often, I mean always. But it's okay, because my efforts were usually rewarded with a complimentary chapati. And so despite being brought up in a fairly sexist country, for honest world, I always had a hard time digesting the notion that women were somehow subvertive, or inferior in our societies. As I mentioned, my grandmother was brought up by a single mother. She's the queen of our family, and my aunts are the centerpiece that's held us together. This is not to say that I did not inherit the toxic ideas of masculinity that are so pervasive and enticing for young men. I speak to my brethren when I say, let's remove the responsibility of speaking out, simply by admitting that although we haven't personally assaulted a woman, we are implicated as beneficiaries of the larger silencing and othering of women that allows us to navigate the space that we occupy with a certain ease and comfort that most women have to fight for. At the same time, a narrative that carries women, particularly African women, as only victims of their society is woefully lacking, because it fails to recognize the means by which they formed not only the communities they are part of, but the larger world that we live in today. In monumental ways, like in anti-colonialism struggles, where you had women carrying resources and letters across enemy lines, nursing soldiers and picking up weapons, and fighting and dying. But even in the symbols we look up to, like Wangari Maathai, for instance, who was beaten for trying to protect the Karura forest. She later on was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for her efforts for environmental conservation long before it was a trending topic in Paris. None of these truisms are novel. The Agikoyo mythology tells us of a society structured around the collective strength of women. Distorted by colonialism, that also distant, barbaric fact that dreadlocked Pan-Africanists ramble on about, aside from the fact that when my mother was born, she would be considered a subject of the British Empire. Colonialism, at least as Ngugi wa Thiong'o tells us, was characterized by 3 C's: There was Christianity, a distorted tool used to disorder or dysfunctionalize the communities that existed in the pre-colonial context. There was commerce as well, a means of extracting the wealth of these communities and plunging them into the poverty that we can't quite seem to understand today. And of course, conquest, physical conquest, but also the mental kind, that worked to distort the minds of the colonizer, to allow them to believe they were inferior, but the colonizer themselves as well. In doing so, allowing them to believe that their mission to civilize the savage African was not only justified, but a benevolent obligation. For me, what this meant is that when my Guka Warugongo, my grandfather's brother, referred to me as my brother, or my grandmother referred to me as Murata Wakwa, which means my husband, or my aunts referred to me as Ide, which means my father, these sentiments were lost to me. My first day of school taught me that my name wasn't neutral. And so, with the help of those around me, I formed more palatable versions of my name. D, Ndi, Pingu, Kirange, weird things, and even Junior. I'm not alone in this. Many Kenyans have what we call their English name or their Christian name given to them at baptism. But unfortunately, in doing so, in morphing their names, in choosing to disregard their history, they're not only rejecting, in my case, the memory of my grandfather and the larger collective memory of the Agikuyu people and of Kenya, but they're losing their identity. Thankfully, there were those around me who were kind and patient enough to remind me of the truth, the holistic heritage and history, the fullness of my blackness and Africanness. And so in an unorthodox move, I was named Ndirangu Warugongo Jr. I'm the brother to my Guka Warugongo, I'm the husband to my grandmother, and I'm the father to my aunts and mother. So I'd like to ask you, what is your name? But before you answer, I'd like you to think about it, because I'd hate for you to miss the opportunity to fly. Thank you.